started. So just so all of you are checking up on this, I do want to make sure all of you are making reasonable progress on your final project. I asked you to prepare abstracts on these with benchmarks in part so you can't fool yourself, so you know if you're making the progress you should be making on your project. So if you're not keeping up with the benchmarks you set, now is probably a good time to talk to me about that if you need any revision in your project, because it turned out to be harder than you thought it would be. I'll hand out some guidelines for the final presentations, the reports and the talks you'll give, so I'll give those out at the end of class. I would say I'm pretty flexible about the write-ups, so when you get to that, it's kind of suggestions for those of you who haven't done a lot of these kinds of write-ups. For the talks, though, it is very important that you stick to the guidelines for the amount of time per talk, because we really do have to get through everyone's presentations into the class sessions. So I give specific time guidelines, so when you see those, just be aware that we really do need to be strict about those. So any questions about that or about any of the material we've been studying up till now? Any issues yet on the last homework? Okay, just please remember that next Thursday is a holiday, so next Tuesday is when the next homework is due. Okay, so I guess we'll move on to our next topic here. And what we're talking about is going to be a topic known as model structure determination. And I realized that it would be helpful for me to explain some material I decided to skip from an earlier lecture. So as I mentioned, most years I've presented hidden Markov models, and usually that ends up not being too useful to most of you because you cover it elsewhere. But I do just want to present some basic definitions because I think it's useful for illustrating what structure determination is. So for well, you should all know what a basic Markov model is. So a Markov model consists of a set of nodes, so we call that Q. It consists of a set of initial probabilities, P1 through Pn. So that would be the initial probability vector. And what's the third thing in the standard Markov model? So aside from a state set and an initial probability vector, what do you need to specify a Markov model? Transition. Yes, you need a transition matrix. And a hidden Markov model is basically the same thing, except that we have to add two additional elements. And one of them is what we would call an output alphabet sigma. So this would be some sigma 1 through sigma m. And the other is an output matrix B, which consists of one column one row, or really doesn't matter whether you call it row or column, but let's say one row for each state in the model, and then one column for each of the possible outputs. So we get a B11, B1m, Bn1, Bnm. And this differs from a standard Markov model in that as you move through the states of the model, so let's say we have a state set Q1, Q2, Q3, we would assume that each time you pass through a state, you emit one letter or one character from the output alphabet. So these are commonly used as a way of generating some sort of sequence data. For example, it might be that the output alphabet is a set of set of nucleotides, so A, C, G, and T. And then as we move through sets of states, each of these states would have a characteristic probability distribution of nucleotides that it emits. So, for example, it might be that Q1 really likes to output A's, Q2 maybe output C's or G's with equal probability, and Q3 really likes to output T's. And then a model like this would give a way of generating patterns of sequences. And commonly this is something we would use to recognize a particular kind of sequence pattern. So by training the model to learn the edges of edge probabilities and output probabilities, you can get it to match particular kinds of sequences. And this is something in previous years I mentioned, I often use after EM as a way of illustrating a kind of expectation maximization algorithm called Baum-Welch, which is a way of learning the quantitative parameters of the model. So learning the transition probabilities and learning the output probabilities, so that you can build a model that's particularly good for outputting things that look like a set of training data available to you. So, for example, if you've got a set of nucleotide sequences that you know represent some particular pattern that this thing is supposed to recognize, then Baum-Welch as an EM algorithm lets you learn the probabilities for this model so that it recognizes whatever pattern is reflected in those sequences. So that basically is a hidden Markov model. And I mention this because it, as I say, it makes for some good examples for the topic we'll be talking about today called structure determination. So how many of you have seen hidden Markov models before or know what a hidden Markov model is? Dr. Duran stopped covering hidden Markov models? Okay, well, I think this is a good thing to be aware of. You should at least know what a hidden Markov model is, but maybe that you'll be covering it later in the term for those of you taking computational genomics or computational molecular biology. But for now, just be aware that this is something that exists and that there are good algorithms for learning quantitative parameters of these models. The probability parameters we would often be interested in to train the model to match the pattern captured in a set of sequence data. So one example of how these are used is that there are ways of recognizing protein domains, so small pieces of structure in a protein, where you take examples of the domains and you train hidden Markov models to recognize each of these patterns. So you could recognize that there's a particular fold of protein that maybe occurs in a lot of different proteins by recognizing characteristic patterns of the sequences that produce it. And then you can train a library of hidden Markov models to recognize different patterns. And then when you're given new sequence, you can run that through the hidden Markov models and see if you're looking at something that looks like an example of that pattern. So does that make sense to everyone? Okay, so I mentioned that just because it kind of illustrates one example of this problem we'll be talking about today, which is the problem basically of figuring out the stuff you can't learn by an algorithm like Baum-Welch. So Baum-Welch, or EM in general, is good for learning these kinds of quantitative parameters. So figuring out that maybe this probability should be 0.9 and that self-transition of 0.1, or learning that this thing should have an output probability of 99% A and 1% T, or whatever. Those things you can learn by EM. But where this becomes an issue is if we want to learn about the discrete aspects of the model. And very often a model is going to combine continuous aspects, which we've been spending a considerable amount of time studying, with discrete aspects, and we actually want to be able to learn both of those. So to illustrate where that might come up, let's imagine we've got one of these HMM, hidden Markov model kinds of models, and what we're trying to do is recognize the promoter for a particular kind of sequence. So we believe that there is a gene, so this would represent the transcribed region of the gene, and it has some transcription factor binding sites upstream of the gene. And we know when we look in lots of different organisms, maybe there is a transcription factor A and B and C that we canonically see binding to this sequence. Each of those has a particular binding site with some base probabilities that specify whether that is that basically tell us how often particular bases are used in those binding sites. We might have some variable spacer regions between these. And we could propose a hidden Markov model as a way of recognizing these, where maybe we would say that we come into the model, we have a set of states that represent the A site. So maybe these 4 states here represent the base preferences for the A site. And if it really likes to start with a T, followed by a G, followed by a C or an A, then you can put those preferences into those bases. We can implement a spacer region by having some kind of generic background frequency with a self-transition to it. And then we could do the same thing with the B site. Implement a spacer region, and do the same thing with a C site. And then what we can do is come up with this kind of model where we've specified the graph that underlies the model, and then we can use examples of this promoter region to train the model and learn what the probabilities should be for all of these transitions. So how often do you take the self transition before moving on to the B site? What should be the output probabilities from each of the bases to recognize an A site or a B site or a C site, and so forth. And by learning this, we can come up with something that we could then use to recognize new examples of this. So to go into new, let's say, genomes and find other examples of genes under this particular kind of regulation. So does that make sense to everyone? Okay, so this is something we can do by the techniques we've already learned. So expectation maximization through the Baum-Welch algorithm gives us a way of learning those probabilities. But where it becomes a structure determination problem is if I throw in one more complication here. And suppose I throw in the complication that we don't know if B is actually required in the sequence. So maybe we're really confident that this particular transcription factor binding site regions, these particular promoters, has to have a site for an A transcription factor and a C, but we're not sure if it has to have a site for a B. So we'd like to propose that maybe it's possible to take a shortcut edge that goes around B, just skips straight from A to C. And we want to know if that edge should actually be in our model or not. So that's an example of a structure determination problem. Basically trying to figure out, in this case, the structure of the graph, or in general, trying to figure out discrete aspects of the model as opposed to continuous things like the probability parameters. So is that clear to everyone? All right, so that basically is the problem we're going to be dealing with, and this comes up in a lot of different guises in model inference, because lots of models can be thought of as having both discrete and continuous elements. So, for example, we can see other instances of graph-based structure learning, and very often will come down to learning an underlying graph. So it might be that we're studying a transport network. So maybe we're looking at molecules that are being passed through different organs or different parts of a tissue or whatever, and we know that there is some transport pathway, A to B to C to D, and we're not sure if there is some alternate pathway it can take to go from A straight to D. We'd like to know if our evidence supports the existence of that pathway, so the measurements of these different quantities at different points in time supports the existence of a bypass pathway, so that would be another example of a structure determination problem. Figuring out, is the graph better explained by a single path from A through B through C to D, or is it explained by having two paths? That would be another structure determination problem. You could also have a similar problem in a protein-protein interaction network inference. In these cases, we may have sets of different proteins that we know bind to one another, and maybe we're not sure if the model supports the existence of a particular interaction. So we might have evidence that, for example, this protein and this protein are often found in a common complex together. And we don't know if it's because they're usually connected to other common proteins, or if it's because there is an edge between those two proteins supporting a direct interaction between them. That would be another example of a model structure determination. All right, so let's go back then to this hidden Markov model version of the problem and try to figure out how we would solve that. So how, given a set of training sequences, could we figure out if this edge belongs in our model? So one way I could propose we could do that is, if you accept that we have an algorithm that can learn these quantitative parameters, in some sense what we're asking here is there a non-zero probability of jumping from here to here? So I'll suggest a solution. Let's throw the edge in train the model to learn the optimal probability parameters. And if this edge has probability 0, then we favor the model. It doesn't have it. If it has a non-zero probability, then we'll say that edge should have been there. So that's not a good solution to this problem. Can anyone tell me why? Why is this not simply the same as determining whether this edge would fit to a probability 0 of transition? Well, the main issue there is that when we're dealing with real data, the data is almost always going to be noisy, and it only takes a little bit of noise to determine that there is a slightly better model by throwing in a non-zero edge probability. So maybe we've got some mistaken data where it just happened that because of a sequence assembly error, we were missing the B site, even though it should really be there. And so it's just slightly better in the model likelihood if we allow a 0.001% chance of going straight from A to C. That's probably not the answer we really want. We want to know if our data actually robustly or strongly supports the existence of that edge. So it's not enough to just say, is there a slightly better model if you can make that edge 0.001 instead of 0? Everyone follow that? Okay, so that's not quite going to solve the problem for us. So I'll suggest another alternative that is slightly better, but still won't quite solve the problem, and that is create two models. So we'll create one model where we've got a graph GA, consists of a vertex set, that would be our node set Q, and an edge set EA. And I'll just abbreviate with a shorthand here. This box will be the A binding site, and then we'll have the generic edge, B binding site, generic edge, and C binding site. And we'll create this model GA, which doesn't have that edge. And then we'll create another model, GB, which will consist of the same node set, or state set, an edge set B, and then it will basically be the same thing, except that we will throw in that edge that we think may or may not be there. So we've now got two candidate models, and then what we're going to do is run our expectation maximization, learn parameters for model A, learn parameters for model B, and we're going to end up getting out of EM a maximum likelihood. So probability of our data X given model A, call that lambda sub A, where lambda A here is going to be equal to a probability vector PA, transition matrix capital PA, an output matrix B sub A, common alphabet, and then graph G sub A. So we run a maximum likelihood inference on that. And we get out some number, which we'll call LA, the likelihood of model A. And then we'll do the same thing with model B. So we'll find the max likelihood over a lambda B, which would be probability of our training data X, given lambda B, that we'll call LB, where lambda B now is the best fit initial probability vector, best fit transition matrix, best fit output matrix, and then the common alphabet, and then fixed graph GB. So we're just saying, in one version, we've got this model. We're assuming we know the discrete parts, that is, we know the underlying graph. We learn best fit continuous parameters. That gets out likelihood. And then we do the same thing with this one. We assume we know a different graph, do a maximum likelihood calculation on the quantitative parameters, and that trains the model and learns the maximum likelihood LB for this model. And then we just ask, is better than LA? That means the data is better explained by model B than model A, so we say the edge should be there. If LB is lower than LA, then that means the model A better explains the the data, so the edge shouldn't be there. So that would be seemingly a more rigorous way of solving this problem, but I'm going to assert that this doesn't work either. Can anyone tell me what's wrong with this solution? Well, we can kind of see why this can't possibly work, because if we're learning from this model, it's always possible it's going to learn probability 0 for this edge. And if it does learn probability 0 for this edge, then the best fit on all the other parameters has to give us the same likelihood as you would get from model A. So in other words, it's actually impossible for this model to have a worse likelihood than this model. It's always going to be able to learn something at least as good, and even if perturbing this a little bit can make it slightly better, so making this 0.001 instead of 0, that can give you even a little boost, then this model is going to be better. So basically, if you try to do things this way, you're always going to learn that model B is the better model. So it's a kind of overfitting problem. Does that make sense to everyone? Any questions at this point? Okay, so that explains then why a couple of obvious things you might try won't solve this problem, but they also help us get to a way of actually solving the problem. And typically the way we would actually want to solve this problem is using a concept I mentioned briefly previously, but that becomes very important in these structure inference problems, and that's what's called a prior probability. So does anyone remember what a prior probability is? So prior probability is basically something we think we know about an aspect of the model before we've looked at the data. So it's kind of a bias we put in to tell us that some models are more intrinsically plausible than others. And a very common way we use prior probabilities that allows us to solve this structure inference problem is to use what's called an anti-complexity prior. So an anti-complexity prior is basically a way of saying that if we have two models that we're considering, then before we look at the data, we are going to believe that the simpler model is better. We're going to try to penalize more complicated models because that's the only way it's going to be possible to learn a simpler model rather than a more complicated one. So if you put in a prior that tells you that this model is more intrinsically plausible, then it's possible for this model to have a better likelihood than this model. So what I want to do is go through a few standard ways of doing that. So probably the simplest one is to put in something that allows us to take, let's say, our model lambda A, where really we're talking about the probability of the graph GA. And the way we would do this is to say that we want to favor graphs that have fewer edges. And a very simple way of doing that tends to work well in practice is to say that we will exponentially weight the prior based on the complexity of the graph. And usually we would quantify the complexity of the graph in terms of the number of edges. So we can say that there is an intrinsic prior probability of e to the minus size of the edge set of A for model A. And then we can say similarly the prior probability of model B would be equal to e to the minus size of the edge set of B. And what that's effectively saying is that because this model has one more edge than this model, then we're going to give this model a kind of extra boost of an extra boost of a factor E in its likelihood. And what that can do is say that if we've got no data that particularly favors this model over this one, then this model will show up as having a better likelihood. But if there is good data saying that this edge really should be there, then that's going to overwhelm the anti-complexity prior, and we'll learn model B. Does that make sense to everyone? All right, so if we do that, then what we would end up doing is basically saying that we're going to get a maximum likelihood. So now L sub A will be the max over the quantitative parameters PA, capital PA, PA of, now we would learn probability of the data given model A times the prior probability of model A. And we would learn that LB is maximum over the quantitative parameters little pb, capital PB, and B sub B of the probability of our training data given model B times the prior probability of model B. And if we have a way of learning this independent of the priors, then as long as we're just considering two models like this, it's very easy to solve for the value with the priors thrown in. We just solve our maximum likelihood on the part without the priors, and then it's very easy to figure out what factor the priors adds in and get our corrected likelihoods LA and LB. And at this point, we could actually do this. We could actually try this, and this test would give us a way of deciding whether the more complicated or the simpler model is actually favored by the data. So does that make sense to everyone? All right, so this very simple kind of prior that I've described here is equivalent to something that is widely used for these kinds of structure determination problems called the Ahike information criterion, or AIC test. So very often this is something we'll do when doing model inference problems. You'll come up with some way of quantifying the complexity of the model, and then you throw in this AIC penalty to model complexity, and that will give you a more robust way of learning a model that's really supported by the data and avoiding the overfitting problems you get if you don't have some way of penalizing more complicated models. So more often you'll see this phrase slightly differently. So usually when people quantify likelihoods, what they're using are log likelihoods, and then the simplifies, you're taking log of e to the minus model complexity, just becomes basically adding the number of variables in the model. But this is basically another way of posing a standard way of doing this kind of model simplification. And there are, is there a question?
I'm just wondering, so is this more aggressive than the BIC, or is it less aggressive?
This is less aggressive. The BIC is usually going to be a more conservative way of fitting your model. All right, so there are a number of variations on this. I'll get to the BIC in a moment, but there are versions of the AIC you'll sometimes see. So there's one that's known as the AIC-C, which is the corrected AIC. That looks like the following. Probability lambda A is equal to e to the minus model size, so number of variables in the model effectively. And then you throw in a correction factor that looks like EA plus 1 over X, where X here I'm referring to the amount of training data you have, minus EA minus 1. So this, let's see, yeah, it's probably easier to write this as e to the minus this thing. So it's e to the minus model size times e to the minus this thing. And what this does is basically give you a better way of dealing with cases where there's not a lot of training data. In the limit of large amounts of training data, this basically goes away and you just get the standard AIC. It does a little better if X is not too big, so if you don't have a lot of sequence to learn from, it will basically force you to pick simpler models than the pure AIC would give you, which will tend to give you a somewhat better fit to the data, or at least a more robust model. You'll sometimes see a more kind of ad hoc but simpler way of doing these kinds of things, which is the regularized AIC, or regularization in general, where often you will throw in just kind of an extra parameter, and you'll say that the probability of your model is going to be e to the minus some scaling factor nu times the size of the model. that gives you a way of tuning it to be more or less conservative by basically picking this value new, and then you can try to choose one that is biasing it to the amount of complexity you want. As I say, it's kind of ad hoc. It's often something you see in these kinds of model inference papers, that it's just something you can kind of play with in the model that tends to make a model less believable because you don't know if someone's kind of cheating and tuning this to give the result they want. That's often something you'll see in practice. Any questions about that? So the major alternative to the AIC models for this kind of thing, which was mentioned before, is the Bayesian information criterion. Or BIC. So this, like the AIC, you usually see it phrased in terms of the log likelihood, but basically it's equivalent to saying that the complexity of the model, or the penalty for complexity, is square root of the size of your data set to the minus size of the model. And that tends to give you a more conservative penalty, where it's, in a sense, better taking account of how much data you have to support the model. So you're giving a stronger penalty if you don't have a lot. Well, basically you're saying the more data you have, the more you should be relying on the evidence of the data. So the stronger the support in the model likelihood needs to be to support greater complexity in the model. So it tends to be a somewhat stricter penalty than the AIC, but basically people use them kind of interchangeably. Either one can be used for controlling complexity in their models. All right, any questions about any of that? So there are some other ways of doing this. Often we'll use a kind of sort of ad hoc way of controlling for this, where maybe instead of saying that we're going to penalize strictly for the size of the model, we'll penalize for something that looks like the following. Sum of the coefficients of these things we're learning. So, for example, we can penalize for the sum of the coefficients of the B matrix and the transition matrix. And, well, not the sum of absolute values. This may seem like a more ad hoc thing to do. If you want to penalize for the complexity, logically you should be penalizing for the size of the model, not the values of the parameters. But this tends to be a good thing to do for computational reasons. It's much easier to solve for. And those of you taking the graduate version of the class, the problem 5 on the current homework assignment is related to this kind of model regularization. So if you haven't looked at that yet, that'll walk you through another way of doing this kind of model complexity control. But that's just something I mentioned that's an aside for now. Any questions about any of this? Okay, so all of that is kind of giving us the principles of how we would control for complexity of a model. But in practice, it can get a lot more complicated. And to understand why that's the case, let's suppose that we were looking at these models, and instead of trying to consider whether one particular edge is there, let's say we've got a set of these possible states, and we think there might be lots of different shortcut edges in it. So maybe we're not sure which of these possible jumps in the model might be allowed, and we want to consider what is the best model, allowing that any of these edges may or may not be present in the model. Right, so suppose we've got 100 of these different edges that may or may not be present in the model. What's the problem with using the solutions I've already told you about? Why not just try all the different models we might be interested in, evaluate their likelihoods with respect to whatever training data we have, and pick the most likely one?
You have exponential number of points.
Yeah, so in the general case, we're trying to figure out what edges are present in a graph. If it's a non-trivial size graph, then you're going to have an exponentially large number of possible graphs. You can't go through and run EM on 2 to the 100th possible graphs and learn the likelihood for each and pick the best one. So we need other ways of dealing with this in practice. And generally what we need to do is find some way of solving for the model likelihood problem where we're not explicitly evaluating the likelihood of every possible model. Right, so one way we could think about this is, let's suppose we have a way of evaluating the likelihood for any particular kind of graph, and we have a way of evaluating the complexity penalty. So if I give you any particular graph, we can come up with the complexity penalized likelihood for that particular graph. Well, if we can do that, then what we've got in some sense is a discrete optimization problem. So we can take any graph, we can add an edge, we can remove an edge. Whatever we do to that graph, we can get a score that tells us how good it is. So we have an optimization problem, or we have a way of evaluating the score, or the objective function for any given graph. So what can we do with that? If I gave you a routine that figured out the likelihood for any possible graph, how could you design a solver for that? Well, in the general case, this is going to be an intractable problem. So you probably aren't going to be able to design a solver that's guaranteed to get the optimal solution in sub-exponential time. But often we would deal with solving hard problems, and we have ways of dealing with that. So what would be an example of something we could use?
Heuristic search?
What's that?
Heuristic search?
Yeah, so there are lots of different heuristics we could try. So we might try, for example, let's say a genetic algorithm. So in a genetic algorithm search, we would want to come up with some way of representing a genome for a problem. So we might say that our problem genome, G1 for a given graph, is simply a vector of the edges of that graph. So maybe we'd have potentially an edge 1, 2, an edge 2, 3, an edge 2 to 4, an edge 1 to 4, and so forth. And then a genome of a problem would be simply a binary string telling us which edges are present in the graph. And then for a genetic algorithm, you would want to define evolution operations. So you would want to have a mutation operation. And what might a mutation operation for this graph genome look like?
To change one of the edges.
Yeah, so
or
just,
add one edge.
yeah, just randomly flip one bit. So we would transform G with some particular edge E to G with that edge inverted. And that would give us a mutation operation. And then, what else do we need in a genetic algorithm?
Crossover.
Yeah, so we have a crossover operation. And for the crossover operation, we would want to take the G1, cross it with the G2, and what might that look like? Well, we could just run through all the bits and at random pick each bit from G1 or G2. And there are probably more intelligent ways you could do that, but basically we could pick some of these from G1, some of these some of these from G1, some of these from G2, and so forth, and end up with a kind of hybrid graph. And once we've got those operations, then a genetic algorithm is going to be relatively straightforward. So we might say, for example, that we'll start with some initial guesses. So we start with some G1 through Gn, which is maybe just a set of randomly chosen graphs. And then we repeat the following steps. So we could say for all Gi and G1 to Gn, we max likelihood, over a model, G sub I of probability of the data given model I. So we've got a set of likelihoods, and then we can generate a set of mutants, G1 prime to Gn prime by mutating G1 to Gn. And we could generate n recombinants by making random Gi, Gj. So we've then got our n original models and n mutant models and n recombinant models. Let's call those Gi double prime. And then pick the best n of those 3n models, and then just go back here and just keep doing that. And then at that point we've got a genetic algorithm. It may not find an optimal model, but it would give us a reasonably efficient way of finding a pretty good model, probably, that would do a good job of optimizing the likelihood for our system. Does that make sense to everyone? All right, so that would be an example of something we could do to solve for a system like this. And that would be a way of taking this problem of model structure determination or likelihood inference in the presence of both discrete and continuous variables and turning it into an optimization problem. If we don't want to solve this as an optimization problem, what alternatives do we have?
Do sampling and simulations.
Yeah, so we might pose a sampler for models. So let's imagine how that might work. We could take the same model representation, so we can say that a model will represent as a vector of the edges that are present in it. And then we could say, when given some GI, we'll pick GI prime by mutating one edge at random. So we pick among all the possible edges in the graph. If the one we pick is there, then we remove it. If it isn't there, we add it. So we get a model GI prime. We evaluate likelihood of model I, so the likelihood of our original model, and we evaluate likelihood of model L prime, or model I prime. So that would be our mutated model. And then if Li prime greater than Li, move to Gi prime, else move with probability Li prime over Li. So what kind of sampler have I described here? Just repeatedly run through these steps. What are we doing here?
Metropolis.
Yeah, this is a Metropolis sampler. So we know how to evaluate the likelihood of a model. We should be able to figure out how to evaluate the likelihood of the perturbed model. And if we can get the ratio of likelihoods of the two models, then it's very easy to come up with a Metropolis sampler. And we can run this through a bunch of steps, and we'll end up with a sample over the set of models weighted by the likelihood of the data with respect to each model. Right, so suppose we do that. What might be an advantage of that over the optimization approach? Why might we prefer this solution to the optimizing solution?
Guaranteed to be, I mean, eventually make it a purple.
Yes, if you run it long enough, you're guaranteed to eventually get a good sample. So if you run it long enough, it would eventually tell you what is the optimal model. But it also gives you a lot of other useful information, because you're not just getting one model, you're getting a distribution over models. So we might observe that when we look at some of the states of interest, maybe it happens that 100% of models have this particular edge here. So it always ends up sampling models that have this edge, or close to 100%. But maybe it ends up that it never picks models that have this edge, and maybe 50% of the time, it picks models that have this edge. So what would that tell us? Why might we care about that? Well, in some sense, we're learning about not just the best model, but how much confidence we should have in particular features of the model. So if we run our sampler and we see something like this, then it's telling us that some edges are very strongly supported by the data, some edges their absence is very strongly supported by the data, and some edges are uncertain. That might be something we particularly care about in making conclusions, or it might be something that suggests to us that we should try to gather more data that would allow us to resolve the uncertainty in that edge, and either get data that will allow us to say this edge really should be there, or get data that will allow us to say it really shouldn't be there. So does that make sense to everyone? It's also worth remembering that if we have a model like this, so we've constructed a metropolis model, there are actually a couple of ways of turning a metropolis model into an optimization method. So if we simply take this ratio Li prime over Li, then we can raise that to a power 1 over t, where t is a parameter that we'll want to vary, and then run the model starting with a very large t, and then as we run, start shrinking the t until it gets very close to 0. That will tend to have the effect of that early on, because we're raising this to a large power, you are more or less flattening the probability distribution, so you get a very even sample, and later as t gets close to 0, you are sharpening the probability distribution, so it settles in on a local optimum. So that is a heuristic optimization method. Does anyone remember what that's called?
Simulated annealing?
Yes, that's simulated annealing. So if you can build a metropolis sampler, it's relatively easy to build a simulated annealing heuristic optimizer. And there's also a version of this where we would just effectively do this pretending t is 0 all along. So pretending we're in the limit of maximally sharpening our probability distribution. And does anyone know what that's called? So basically what that would do is say that we only take a move if it leads to a local improvement, and we have no probability of ever taking a move that gives you a worse model. So that's it. You often won't see that phrased as a metropolis model. That's equivalent. That's known as hill climbing. So hill climbing is kind of the discrete version of a local continuous optimizer. You just do locally optimal moves until you end up in a local optimum of your discrete problem. And that tends to be a relatively simple heuristic that's often used for these kinds of things. So any questions about any of that? All right, so going back to the sampling approach, suppose we don't use a metropolis sampler. What alternative have we covered? What other sampling methods have we seen? Yeah, so that's the other sampler we've seen, the Gibbs sampler. And a Gibbs sampler would be, we could create one that looks almost the same as this. We just have a slight difference in how we decide whether or not to take the move. Basically what it would come down to is, with probability Li prime over Li plus Li prime, you take the move, and with probability Li over Li plus Li prime, you don't take the move. And then then you end up with a Gibbs sampler, otherwise it's exactly the same for this system. Does that make sense to everyone? All right, so that gives us a few alternatives for solving this problem. So I asked you before why we might prefer the sampling method over the optimization method. Why might we prefer optimization over sampling? Why might we want to use the genetic algorithm rather than Metropolis sampling? The main reason usually is efficiency. So usually it's much easier to solve for the optimum of a probability distribution than to get a good sample of the whole distribution. If you have a good sample, it's trivial to optimize. Just pick the maximum thing you've encountered, but it's not trivial in the opposite direction. So usually optimization is going to run much more quickly. So people often for hard models will favor an optimizer versus solving the maximum likelihood model versus a sampler that would give you a sample over the posterior distribution. So any questions about any of that? Okay, so I will mention one other alternative that we often have. So in some instances, we can kind of combine the best of both of these systems to a degree and get advantages of a sampler method, but also get some of the advantages of an optimization method. And a common way that's done is with a technique called bootstrapping. So let's suppose that we are running our model. We're trying to learn our likelihood. And we've got a set of data we'll call X, consists of various sets of sequences that we're using to train our model. And I'll imagine that maybe we've got a large set of these. We've got maybe M different sequences. What bootstrapping does is basically the following. We take our sequences and then we pick a subsample of these sequences with replacement. And what that means is that we'll take these M sequences and we'll pick M sequences, but we're allowing the possibility that the same sequence will get chosen more than once. So maybe this is our first sequence and this is our second sequence, but maybe this one gets picked again as our third sequence. So we get a kind of biased data set where probably we'll have some repeats. So it will, if we've got lots of sequences, it'll look a lot like the data set we started with, but you'll have this kind of bias where probably you'll have fewer distinct sequences in it and some overweighting of some sequences relative to others. And then we will take this data set and we will run our optimizer. So we fit our model. So fit the maximum likelihood, and we get some model out of this. Let's call that lambda sub I. And we just repeat that for many rounds of optimization. So maybe we repeat it 100 times or 1,000 times. And with the bootstrap approach, what we would then do is something very like what we would do with the sampling approach. We get our 100 or 1,000 models, and then we basically average them. We see that maybe every single time we run this, one particular edge is present, and maybe every time we run it, another edge isn't present, but half the time we run it, another edge is present. Basically, it gives us something that's sort of equivalent to what we would get from a sampling method. We get confidence in particular pieces of the model. So does that make sense to everyone? Right, so bootstrapping also has some advantages and disadvantages relative to these other approaches. So what would be an advantage of just doing a single maximum likelihood solver versus bootstrapping? Well, the only real advantage usually is that it's faster. So with bootstrapping, you're solving the maximum likelihood problem enough times to get reasonable statistics. It's going to mean you'll need at least 100 or maybe 1,000 or so replicates. So it's going to be 100 or 1,000 times slower than just solving the pure model. That's the main reason not to do this. Bootstrapping may or may not be faster than sampling, so it depends on how many times you do the bootstrapping and how many steps you need for the sampler. So that may be an advantage of bootstrapping over sampling or vice versa. It is a less versatile kind of thing than the sampling, so it's much easier to pick a probability distribution over models and sample many different features in many ways. There might be uncertainty in the model. Bootstrapping, you're pretty much reduced to uncertainty over the data points. So basically, you're always going to be subsampling your data set. There are only so many ways to do that. So in some sense, it's a less versatile kind of thing when running a sampler. But basically, it's one alternative we have available. And usually, we'll get in the, I guess a week from now, into questions of model validation. Usually, if you're not doing a sampler, you want to do something like bootstrapping, so you have some idea of your confidence in features of the models. All right, any questions about any of that? Okay, so that gives us a few alternatives we can look at for a model like this. And it's worth noting that this kind of structure inference applies to quite a few different kinds of models. So let's look now at the transport model example I'd given earlier. And this might be something as less obviously represented as a probability distribution, so that's a likelihood. So maybe we've got a model that we are proposing as a possible set of transport pathways, and we're not sure which edges are supposed to be in this model. So we might go and gather some data. So we might see that at various points in time, time t0, we've got particular amounts of A, B, C, and D. And we can observe that at time t1 is evolved in some way, and so forth. And then we might propose that if we think there's a transport network here, then whatever edges are present in the model ought to have some rate constants associated with them. There might be a KAB here, a KBD, a KBC, for whatever edges are present in whatever model we're trying to learn. And we might propose then that this data should be described by, let's say, a set of differential equations. So we could say that dAdt is maybe minus KAB minus KAD minus KAC times A. That would tell us how A should be evolving through loss of A through all the transport pathways out of it, and dB dt might evolve through some possible loss of B to D, and possible loss of B to C, times the amount of B, plus maybe gain based on the amount of A, and so forth. We could run through, set up basically mass action equations, and come up with a quantitative description of how we think the data would be generated for a particular model structure. So that would give us a way of representing this. It's maybe not so obviously a likelihood. Now suppose for the moment we were really sure we knew which edges should be there. So we're sure that some of these are 0. So KAC maybe we know is 0, but others we think are confident are non-zero. And we want to learn the K parameters here for a fixed structure. What could we do? So we're, what's that?
Numerical integration.
Yeah, if we know what the parameters are, we could construct a numerical integrator. So what we can do is basically just say that we've got some kind of black box here that's our numerical integrator. We feed in a set of parameters, and so forth, and it spits out a simulation of the system. And then we can compare the simulation to the data we have available and we could compute, let's say, least squares or objective value phi of all of these parameters. So we've got a measure of quality of fit. We know how to compute that. What could we do with that to find the optimal parameters? Well, we've got an objective function. It's an implicitly specified objective function because we can't analytically say what it is, but we can create a computer program that returns that value. And when we have that, then we could come up with a continuous optimizer. So we could find, for example, estimates of the gradient. So find d phi, dkab, and we should know some ways of approximating that. So it would be phi of kab plus some delta k, and then all of the other k values minus phi of kab, and all the other k values over delta k. That would be an approximation to the partial derivative of phi with respect to kab. And we could do that for all the other k's. And then what could we do with that gradient? So if we want to find the least squares best solution for the values, how could we use these numerical approximations to the gradient?
We can do gradient descent to find the zero.
Yeah, and we could do a gradient descent method, try to find the minimum of the least squares solution. That would give us a way of optimizing our parameters. So if we know the structure, then we know how to find optimal parameters. And for some relatively simple ways of representing the problem, you can think of that as doing a maximum likelihood solution to the parameter set. In particular, if we assume that the noise in our measurements is Gaussian, then the least squares best solution to the parameters is going to be the maximum likelihood solution to the parameters. So that follows in general. If you have Gaussian noise, the least squares best fit is the maximum likelihood fit. So we have a way of getting maximum likelihood solutions for our quantitative parameters. Yeah.
Just a general question. So when you're doing gradient descent, and if your objective is like find the maximum or minimum, so do you just randomly initialize a point, and then once you find a zero, then you just check whether it's a maximum minimum point, and it's not just randomly choose your initial conditions again? Is that what usually happens?
Well, for gradient descent, you don't need to worry about that because you're always finding a local optimum, and if you're going in the direction of the minus gradient, your objective function's getting lower, so you're solving directly for the objective function. So there, you don't have to worry about whether it's a maximum or minimum. If you pick minus gradient, it's always going to find a local minimum. If you're using the Newton-Raphson method or bisection, then you're running on the derivative of the objective function, and then you do need to check if it will find a local optimum, and you need to check whether it's a maximum or a minimum.
All right, so if you're doing Newton-Raphson, for example, you would actually, once you find a point, you check it. If it's not, you just randomly initialize again and just try it again?
Yeah, you would start in another place, very often what people use is that would be kind of embedded as a subroutine in a more complicated optimizer that's doing a kind of grid search over possible parameter values or some more intelligent version of a grid search. And then you're basically trying to find all the local optima, and then you just pick which one is the best local optima. Does that answer your question? Okay, any other questions at this point? Okay, so you've seen then for a given structure for this model, how could we optimize for the quantitative parameters, but we haven't yet gotten to the actual structure determination problem. And to do that, what we're going to want to be able to do is to say, what is the likelihood of the data for a given structure of this model? So we're going to want to turn this from a maximum likelihood solution into an actual specification of what the model likelihood is. So that's a more complicated kind of problem with a system like this. But often what we would want to be able to do is to take the experimental data that we have, so maybe we've got a curve that's telling us how much A there is versus time, and a curve that's telling us how much B versus time, and so forth. And what we'd like to be able to do is to fit probability distributions to all of our measured data points to tell us, for a given model, how likely is it that A at this point has this value, and B has this value, and C has this value. So in other words, what we're trying to do is take our best fit solution, which is just going to give us some set of curves here, and turn it into a probability distribution over a family of curves. So can anyone think of a way we could do that? How could we take this ordinary differential equation specification and turn it into something that produces a probabilistic family of curves instead of a single deterministic set of curves? Well, one way of doing that we've seen is we could take this deterministic model and turn it into a stochastic model. So we could say that maybe this first equation will change to dA is minus KAB minus KAD minus KAC times A, and maybe we'll throw in a term A dW1 to reflect that there's some noise in the measurement of A. So what we're then going to get is that every time we run this, we'll get a slightly different trajectory. So maybe we'll have some average, but we'll also have some noise about that average. And by running a bunch of trajectories with what's now a stochastic differential equation, we can get an idea for what the range of values is here. We can figure out what the mean value is, but we can also figure out a variance in values around that point and get some estimate uncertainty. And if you know a mean and a variance, you can more or less approximate a likelihood for the value of A at this particular point. So we can say from that range of curves, how plausible is it actually that at time ti, A has measured experimental value ai? So we can get likelihood of that data point ti, ai as a function of our model parameters. And if we can do that, then we can get a likelihood by just taking a product over all of our different data sources. So A, B, C, D, and a product over all of our time points. So I equals 1 to, let's say we've got m different time points of the likelihood of the data point Ti, let's call this, I don't know, S. Get a likelihood of that data point at that point in time relative to our model. We take the product of that over all the data points and all of the curves, and then what we get out is the likelihood of our complete model. Does that make sense, Barbara? So there are other ways we could do this, but it's a way that we know how to do. So we know how to get stochastic differential equations. We can simulate the uncertainty in the curves, and then we can get a likelihood. And once we have a likelihood, then we've got a way of going about the structure determination problem. So we've now got a likelihood for this continuous system that's specified by stochastic differential equations. And this is something that we would know for a particular graph, let's call it G, and for the maximum likelihood estimate of our K parameters. So let's say that, well, we could evaluate this for a particular set of K parameters, but probably what we would really do is evaluate it for a particular G and the maximum likelihood Ks. And then what can we do with that? We've now got a way of getting a likelihood for any particular structure of our graph. So we can try any possible set of transport pathways and ask what the likelihood of data is relative to that set of pathways. So what do we do with that? Well, at this point, what we've got is pretty close to the models we were talking about before. We can evaluate the likelihood of the data with respect to the graph. And so what we might do is maybe throw in some prior probability on the graph. So we could throw in a BIC or AIC or whatever we want to favor simpler graphs. And then what do we do with that? Well, at this point, we're back to the same kinds of problems we had before. So we could say that we've got now this complexity penalized likelihood for any particular graph. So we can set up a sampler over possible transport graphs. So we could set up a metropolis sampler just like we did before by taking our current graph, randomly adding or removing an edge, getting the perturbed likelihood by running the same process again, looking at the likelihood ratio to decide whether to keep or reject that move, and then we get a sampler over possible transport models for this continuous model representation. Or we could pose it as an optimization problem and optimize over possible model structures by maybe turning that sampler into a simulated annealing heuristic. Does this make sense to everyone? Okay, the main thing I'm trying to illustrate here is that for a lot of these kinds of systems, we basically have the tools we need to solve these problems. So if you understood the things we've talked about earlier in the term about how to optimize discrete models or how to sample over discrete models, those are more or less the same tools we would use to learn structures, or sample over structures in model inference, in much the same way that learning the continuous parameters is using the same tools as we used before for optimizing or sampling over continuous probability distributions. All right, so any questions about any of that? Okay, so I think that basically covers what I wanted to cover about this question of structure inference. In the next class, we'll be seeing the last of our case study lectures, where I'll go through a particular system where a lot of these questions of parameter inference and structure inference come up. So that will be looking at how you learn regulatory networks, or in particular, learning genetic regulatory network models, because that brings in a lot of these basic kinds of techniques. Before we break, I did want to hand out some information on the final project, so you guys can pass these around. So these are just some basic guidelines for writing your project reports and for delivering the oral project presentations. So for those of you who've written scientific papers or anything like that, you're welcome to write in a different format than I'm specifying here. This is just a suggestion, but use this as a guideline for the sorts of things you should be including in your write-up and also in your talk. So there isn't a particular prescribed format for that. As I say, it's just a suggestion. But for the talk part, the one thing that is important is the amount of times is one thing that's important. So I give some particular amounts of time for your talks depending on the group size you're in. So we have 2 class days to get through everyone's presentations, and we really need to get through everyone. So please take the times written on here seriously. I've picked them to make sure that we can get through all the groups and have a little margin for error. But I know it can be hard to give a short talk, but please make sure that your talks fit in that kind of timeline. And other than that, I think that should cover everything you should need to know. As I mentioned at the beginning of class, all of you should be looking at your abstracts, looking at the benchmarks you set for yourselves, and just seeing, are you meeting the benchmarks you set for your final projects? If you aren't and you need to revise because your project turned out to be much harder than you thought, now would be a good time to talk to me about that. So just make sure you're making reasonable progress or talking to me if it's turned out that you can't make progress on the project you set up. So any questions about any of this? Okay, well, I guess we can end a few minutes early today then.